Welcome once again to Beit Avichai for the third of our four-part series. We are going to be doing something a little different this evening, a change of mood. Purim is next week, so that's one reason for perhaps turning around and doing a different text, Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. But there's another reason, perhaps more substantial. And that is that what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks and the concern of the end of the book of Exodus is with the instructions for building the Mishkan, the place where God claims that he will come and dwell in the midst of the children of Israel. We talked about this last week, about this special intimacy that seems to invite, that God wants Israel to make a place for him right at the heart of themselves, a certain kind of intimate relationship. And we talked about the Kabbalistic and Hassidic and other interpretations of this idea. What we're talking about now is the loss of all that. It's the loss of the first temple, which is a later iteration of the Mishkan, the historical destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the people in it, and one particular focus right at the center of the exile, the king Achashverosh, who is supposedly an upstart, according to Midrashic rehistoricizing. Achashverosh doesn't belong to the Babylonian dynasty, the Persian dynasty, but he was a usurper who reigned instead of Cyrus, after Cyrus. Now, so we are now at the heart of Galut. We're at the heart of exile. This king reigns over 127 kingdoms, as we're told right away at the beginning of the book. So we have left our own intimacies in various layers, going down up to the heart of the matter, which is in some way God has a particular relationship with the people of Israel. And we are thrown out of all that, and we are scattered around the world, and we are moving into another center of civilization. It's the alternative center, the center of Galut, the center of, for us, is decentering, center of being away, not being at the center of things anymore, not holding that position. So it's the absence of God, you might almost say. Or perhaps, as Buber puts it, I think it's a better chosen word, perhaps, the eclipse of God, the eclipse of God. And of course, as you may know, this book is unusual in not having one single mention of God's name in the whole text. That, either you've known that forever and it's become boring, or you don't know it and it's interesting. And here I am in the middle now, trying to say there is something very interesting about this, but perhaps in an unexpected way, not the first sight of it. There is an absence of God. There's an eclipse of God. Where is God in this book and in the world that this book represents? So I want to start at a sharp angle by quoting from an essay by David Weiss-Halivni, the great rabbinic scholar. It was an essay that appeared in Judaism a number of years ago, in which he remembers as a teenager, as a 16-year-old, being consigned to a work camp by the Nazis, a work camp, a labor camp called Wolfsburg. And he remembers one particular Rosh Hashanah, and the fervent prayer of the Jews in the camp, to God, in the midst of the camp of the Nazis, on Rosh Hashanah. And he says, and in fact what happened at that time, it's interesting to know about this, was that the Jews were so concerned to have a proper Rosh Hashanah, which was allowed by the Nazis, that they had in their midst Naftali Stern, who was a very important chazan of that time, and he made it his task to write down the text of the tefillah, of the prayer, on old cement bags, that you managed to buy with bread. If you had enough bread, you could buy these old, worn-out cement bags, and that was the paper that he had for writing the text of the prayers of Rosh Hashanah. And you can actually see them in Yad Vashem now. That machzor was given to Yad Vashem. 1944. Now, Weiss Halivni remembers the particular intensity with which they prayed the prayer, Meloch al kol haolam kulo bichvodo. O God, God of our fathers, please assert your rule, Meloch, assert your government over the entire world. Now that's not a personal prayer. There's no room for personal prayers in that optional prayer, blessing that's left in the middle of the Shemona Esrei. It's an impersonal prayer about a dislocated world, a world in which God no longer is king. In a very real existential sense. Hashem melech, Hashem malach, Hashem yimloch leolam va'ed, we say. God is king, God was king, God will be king forever and ever. But as James Kugel points out, and I think it's a very potent idea, you can translate it, he was kinging. Now these are verbs. Not he was a thing, he was really ruling in the past, in the future, but the question is about the present. Is God really ruling now? And there's a profound, almost impersonal feeling among the Jews at that time that God had somehow given over the reins of government to the demonic regime, and the prayer is, come back and pick up the reins of government again. And that's David Weiss Halivni's opening scene. That's what he wants us to remember in his essay. He has another little personal moment in which he remembers as an example of what it means when God has stepped off his throne and left it to someone else, has left it to the nations of the world or the demons of the world. What it means in effect was a story that he finds it hard. It's hard to bear remembering it. He says at one time a Nazi commandant found him hiding where he should have been out, and he was just lifting his riding crop to start giving him a beating. And in terror, the boy begged him, Harachaman, compassionate one, have pity on me. Using the word you would use for God. That is God. And he feels terrible to remembering that afterwards. But it is a kind of symptom of a time in which, where I say mlucha, malchut, has been taken over. God is no longer in charge of the world, to all intents and purposes. That is, from a pragmatic, experiential point of view. Clearly the power is elsewhere. And I want to be suggesting, when we think about this issue of achieving power, holding power, losing power, when we think about this issue, then we can think about it even with a wider filter. It's not necessarily only a matter of government, it's not only a matter of power, but it's a matter of what is a live idea for you in this world. Can God be a live idea in the world of the camps, where God is not manifesting himself, and instead there is sheer whatever the opposite is. So it's the idea of a live idea. That is, does the idea of God at the center of things have any vitality? In the Mishkan, at the time of the Mishkan and of the temple, it had a certain real vitality. Everyone felt it in some way. The talk was about it. You didn't have to be ultra, sanctimoniously religious, to say, if God wills, if God does, over and over again in every sentence. That was like we are so interested in certain, let's say, fashionable, don't misunderstand me, we're interested in certain ideas that are live at this moment. They are the ideas that set our pulses racing. There are times when God is a live idea, and there are times like this when it's not. Now that's David Weiss Halivni's implication here. And he says, what we have at stake here in the disappearance of God, Hester, that God's name disappears from the text. He says it's not a matter of what causes it. He wants to argue against that it's the sin of the Jewish people, that their sins brought this upon them. He finds that an obscene idea, that the camps were a direct punishment for the sins of the Jewish people. Right? That's his reading. And he suggests another possibility. So he says something like this. He says, what is at stake here is the fact that there are cosmic arrangements that God makes with the world. There are times when he fully inhabits the world so that one can feel him. But in a sense, the danger of those times is that human beings have less choice. They have less freedom because it's just in the air. There's something in the air that makes it hard to exercise your individual will. And so there are times when God makes cosmic adjustments. That's his expression. He withdraws, tzimtzum, right? It's the old Kabbalistic idea, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, that there are times when God withdraws his presence. He shrinks his presence out of the world, tzimtzum, and he leaves the world open to other forces, to the forces of humanity. What will humanity do with this freedom? And that sometimes means tragedy. It sometimes means that the most evil forces take over, and hence the prayer to God, please readjust the balance again. Right? There has to be, you have to be in the world, but not too much in the world, because otherwise, where would there be room for us and our autonomy? And so there is this idea of sometimes God leaving an empty space, halal rik, it's called, an empty space, a vacuum of some kind. What happens when we actually look at the text of Megillat Esther? So God's name is not mentioned. And I talked about that as eclipse of one kind or another. The very nature of the book is the book of Esther. And there's a classic pun around that name. Esther, Hester. And a quotation from the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Bayom hahu, and that day there will be times, God says to Moshe before, right at the end, it's right at the end of the Torah. God says to Moshe, on that day I shall indeed hide my face. Haster astir panai. I will indeed absolutely hide my face. This Hester panim, on that day, right? That's what is the where do you see that? What is that a hint to? What does it indicate? Hester, Esther. Esther, the story of Esther, is a fulfillment of that prophecy. That was a time like that. That's like the archetypal time where God is simply in a way sucked out of the world. He doesn't allow his presence to be in the world at all. As if God's presence is a movable feast, It's there sometimes in full force, sometimes it's not so much there. Depends on us, it depends on, it's a very difficult and you can, of course, potentially tragic idea. The idea then of Hester Panim, Esther herself, in her presence, in her story, in what happens to her, is a realization of Hester, of the absence of God, of the eclipse of God. What she has to go through, what she endures in the course of this story, has something to do, very essentially, with the idea of Hester. And my exploration this evening will have to do with the central scene where Esther is basically isolated from all supports and fully experiences her own difficult freedom, to use Levinas's strong expression, difficult freedom. Now, till we get there, we have some business to do. Weiser Livni says at such times, there's always someone who prays. For instance, Rosh Hashanah, a few Jews will get together, even there, and issue a prayer that is energized by that absence of God. That is the engine of that prayer. In the book of Esther, where is there a prayer? If we're going to say that it's a kind of paradigm for that kind of situation, then where is the prayer in the book of Esther? There is no prayer. Right? You can scour the text. There is no prayer. Esther doesn't pray. No one prays. Except that, as you may have heard, you may know, at the most crucial moment of her commitment, of Esther's commitment, decision to commit herself to the salvation of the people in a situation of utmost darkness and uncertainty. At that very moment, the Chachamim, the sages, say, of course she prayed. What did she pray? Before she went in to see the king that day, unbidden, and anyone who goes in unbidden immediately gets his head chopped off. Right? It's immediately. Achat dato lehamit. It's completely uncompromising. There's only one single fate that can befall anyone who goes in to this melech, this counter melech, right? This ersatz king, this king who is filling a space in a demonic way that belongs to God. The only thing that can possibly happen to such a person is that he's killed on the spot. She's killed on the spot. So what, you think she didn't pray? So the sages go, and somewhere on that in this vacuum, she cries out to God. And what does she cry out to God? Of course, which pasuk from Psalms would she cry out to God? Keli, Keli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? Not only me, but everything is concentrated on me now. I hold the fate of my people in my hands, and I feel without any support from the environment, from something around me that gives me strength, that gives me vitality. And it's in that mode that she cries out, claiming a relationship with the absent God, claiming a relationship with the God who is not giving her anything at this moment, who is leaving her in a certain kind of isolation. It's the isolation, you might say, of free will. This is her pure ratzon that's at work here. And it's against all odds. Milvad, there is that rider, unless the king decides that he likes me. Isn't that what she says to Mordechai? We'll come back to that scene. There's only one thing that can happen to me, except. And then there's that little exception which he doesn't think. No, we'll come to that. So I think now we should look at number 1 on your page. This is the Rambam making a very strong claim based on the Talmud in Sanhedrin. All the books of the prophets and all the scriptures, in other words, 2/3 of the Holy Scriptures, everything except for the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, will in the end cease. Atidim libatel. Cease, fall into disuse, be irrelevant, and all the words to translate batel, and be nullified. All the other sacred writings, except for the Torah itself, will fall into irrelevance, will no longer have vitality when the Messiah comes. In the times of the Mashiach, there will come a time when we will no longer bother with those books, except for the Torah, except for the book of Esther and the Torah. I'm simplifying it a little bit. The Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, and the book of Esther, which is just the opposite of the Torah, you might think. The Torah is all about God, and God talking to this one and that one and that one, and being there and being relevant and being, taken up and challenging and right in the middle of the camp. And then the book of Esther, where there's an absolute absence of God. These are the 2 corpuses, these are the 2 bodies of texts that will remain, kayamin, which is the opposite of livatel. It's to be relevant, to endure, litkayem, to endure, but not just to endure. It's to be relevant. It's to be alive. These will retain their vitality into the days of the Mashiach. And this leaves us with the puzzle. Rambam doesn't explain it. He doesn't explain. He simply gives the law. This is the laws where he's talking about, the laws of the Megillah. And not only these texts will remain relevant, but the whole history, all the history of all the miracles that have to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? All the early troubles, as he puts it. All these will in the end fall into disuse. No one will be interested in them anymore. But these days of Purim, lo yebatlu, this history of what happened, the Purim story, will always remain relevant. It'll always be right there at the center, yeah? As it says in the text itself. The text advertises in its own text its own eternity, which is, of course, rather, if it's a human text after all. It's written by two people. It's written by Esther and Mordechai, our heroes. That's the evidence in the text. And they say of their own text that, where is it? Yemei HaPurim lo yibatlu. Yes, shene'emar v'yemei HaPurim ha'ele lo ya'avru mitoch ha'Yehudim v'zichram lo yasuf mizaram. So these books will never be nullified, and the whole history, the story, will never fall into disuse. So that's the situation, that's the paradox, which a lot of ink has been spilt over that, over this notion. This is a favorite subject. And with this, I want to move to the second source. I'm not going to say very much about this. The sages, just casting back for a moment, the sages, in saying that Esther prayed, by the way, that there was a prayer there, they are claiming a hidden prayer in the text of the book of Esther. It's not there on the surface at all. But it must have happened. And that's the claim that the sages make. So at the heart of the book of Esther, there is an address by Esther to God, the God who is eclipsed in the text. That's what the Chachamim, the sages, are asking us to believe, imagine, figure out in our sense of a reality that is a little more complex than the one we might have thought of to start with, where the heroine prays to the eclipsed God, my God, my God. There's a relationship of abandonment here. Again, number 2, we are on the laws of Purim. And sometimes one can learn a lot from the laws. And this is the great Hassidic master, 19th century Hassidic master, the Sfat Emet, from the Gur line, the Gerer line of rabbis, making a point about the order of things on Purim. Mishteh v'simcha, feasting and rejoicing, is commanded not at night, but during the day. Any feasting and rejoicing you do at night, on the night of Purim, is entirely on your own, at your own expense. This is your idea. Right, good, fine, no reason not to. But the real de rigueur, feasting and rejoicing, is during the day. How do we know that? Because the Seudah is certainly during the day. The meal, which is the feasting part, is during the day. And the rejoicing that goes along with it, and what has to have happened before that. Before there can be rejoicing, there has to be kriyat HaMegillah. There has to be the reading of the Megillah. Only after the real reading of the Megillah, again, there's a distinction made, is during the day, not at night. At night we've added that, but that's not the law. The absolute law is during the day. So here you have an order of things. There is reading, and then there's rejoicing. That's the way it has to be. She'al yedei kriyata. How does the Sfat Emet put it very powerfully? She'al yedei hakriya he'arat hanes, mitorer he'arat hanes. Through the reading, the radiance of the miracle comes alive, comes awake. Just as if, you wouldn't really know what to rejoice about if you hadn't just read the Megillah. If you just came to it cold, without the actual reading the text, with what that involves for you, then you would have no real sense of miracle. What? Miracle? What? Where is the radiance of this? Nothing happened, in fact. What happened? So they weren't killed. You want to put it like that? Catastrophe didn't happen. But where is that, what the Sfatimet calls very powerfully, and I want to keep with that image, the radiance, what James Kugel calls the biblical glow. The sense somewhere that this, when we read, we achieve a sense of that kind of radiance that's associated with meaningful moments in history, in life, and in literature. There are certain moments where you just feel that thrill. You say, that's a miracle of God. And suddenly you feel there's something transfigurative, there's something, and that's absent from Purim. Where do you get that on Purim? The fact that everyone is hysterically happy it has something to do with the drink, but why do we have to drink so much to get happy? It's as if we have to work ourselves up into a sense of, illumination, inspiration. No, the real way to do it is to read the Megillah, but really read it, kriyata Megillah, not remember it from last year. The reading of it, right? You have to learn to be a good reader. That's what I want to be arguing. To read it for what's not there and what's obsessively not there and for what is there. Where is the prayer in all this? Where is the relationship with God and with meaning in a context that seems empty of it? And I'm thinking now about endings. How does the story end? Sometimes, I think very often actually, we look to the ending of a story, the ending of a novel, the ending of a book, to cast a glow backwards on the whole book. That is, if you're reading a novel, for instance, and the novel throws you adrift in lots of storms and things going wrong and everything pending, almost like into tragedy, all kinds of things happen in the course of a novel. But if you have a sense that this novel is going to have a happy end, then you read it in one way. Your present moment that you have to live through in the novel becomes different because you expect it to end well. And if you don't think it's going to end well, so there's a certain expectation. How is it going to end? Is it happily ever after, or is it not? You also look somewhere to the past, what has already happened at the beginning of the novel. What kind of novel are we reading? Frank Kermode, the great British literary scholar, has an extraordinary book. It's really one of the classics of the 20th century, called The Sense of an Ending. The Sense of an Ending. And he's talking about apocalyptic moments in history as you approach the year 2000. Remember? Yeah. I think we're all old enough to have been there. Yeah, there is this sense of the end of the world coming. Right? We didn't expect good. The computers were all going to break down, and that was the least of it. A sense of you don't know what it's going to be. Is it going to be a comedy or a tragedy? It's surely going to be significant. And that, of course, affects how you live in 1999 and 1998, and of course we see this historically even more strongly in the more believing times and the more naive times that approach the year 1000, the millennium. There were societies broke down. People took to the roads, were wandering as pilgrims to try to pray for mercy from the impending apocalypse. The world was coming to an end. But if you expect a benign ending, of course, then you have a different sense of the middle, the midst. When you are in the midst, between past and future, in the present moment. The midst is apparently a condensation of the word the middest. It's a superlative middle. The most middle. When you are right bekir bo, you are right there at the center of things. You're in the thrust of things, where things are difficult, let's say, theoretically. There are such times where things feel as if they're not going any place good. Yeah. Right. And there you are in the midst, and the sense of how it's going to end is not good, and that makes the midst very dark. He uses a very simple analogy this is Frank Kermode, Kermode. He uses a very simple analogy of the ticking of a clock. I love this very simple analogy. Everyone knows a clock, what a clock says. tick, tock, tick, tock. Yeah. Of course, clocks don't say tick, tock. They say, if anything, tick, tick, tick. Yeah. But we need to structure time with a beginning and an end. And so we imagine almost like a little house of time. Tick, tock. And now, and so we are in an organized space. Yeah? And we can remember, for instance, psychology experiments have shown that people remember, if they're asked to imitate the ticking of a clock, they remember the distance between the tick and the tock much better than the distance between the tock and the tick. You understand? Yeah? Because the tock and the tick is wild time. It's time that's not covered by the structure. I've made a little structure here, a beginning and end, a beginning and an end. What about the end and beginning? Now, that gives you a sense of, and he talks about the Greek idea, the New Testament idea of chronos and kairos. Chronos, chronology, is successive time. Time, tick, 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 tick. The way it really is, let's say. And kairos is significant time. Time that signs to you that it's important. This is the live time for me. Now I'm right in the middle of things. I'm in the middle and I'm facing an ending that I'm not sure about. Yeah. And so we want to organize it. And that's what happens in history, and that's what happens in the course of a life. The idea of planning one's death, that used to be a religious motif, especially among Christians, but not only, somewhere in some sense preparing for death in the course of life. And that's the way that texts work too. How does Megillat Esther end? You remember, it's a real anticlimax. I mean, I would go as far as to say that from chapter 6 onwards, 6 to 10, it's a hard slog. It's chronicle. It's just this thing after that thing after that thing, and it ends with taxation. There's new taxes on the realm, over the realm. And Mordechai is in a good position, in a fairly good position. That's an unfair translation. Al Rov Echav, right? He was well recognized by most of his brothers. Now, the scholars tell us that we should not read it like that. We should read it by everybody. It really means everybody. But that's not the way it's written. Al Rov Echav. So it's a very parov, it's a very weak ending. There was an excellent ending available. In other words, the midist doesn't have any optimism to look forward to. Right? Now, what happens in the end? What's the redeeming thing that happens in the end? What's the triumph? There was an excellent ending available, as Rashi points out right at the beginning of the book. I put it on your source page. If you want to have a look, it's number 4, I think. Yes, right at the beginning. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Who was he? He was a Persian king who reigned in place of Koresh, at the end of the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. There's an ending. Sof. This is the end of the exile, and no one knows it yet. All right. What happens immediately after this, historically, is that there is, we usually call it the Declaration of Cyrus, 586, so I don't know what Rashi exactly has in mind, but Rashi certainly feels that historically this was the moment of redemption. Immediately after this moment of quasi, almost Shoah, it's the paradigm of a Shoah, immediately after that there was the redemption. Wouldn't that have been a wonderful text if that had been included at the end of the book, right? But the book instead, it goes out with a whimper, not a bang, It goes out in a way weakly. Right? We were going to rethink that, but that's how it feels. And so the sense of the middle, then, the sense of what people have to live through in this narrative, is lacking in biblical glow. Biblical glow is what you feel when you're going through a midst that may be difficult, let's say, but how you expect it to end casts a glow, an anticipatory glow. You feel good, like sometimes, we feel good if we know that something good is waiting for us at the end of the day. Yes? Something I'm very familiar with. It's an absolute feeling of a kind of radiance. That will be good. That will really be good. But there's nothing like that here. Now, that radiance is absent. The glow I'm talking about, yes, that the Megillah, what the Megillah gives us instead of this sense of a glow, of a radiance that comes from knowing there's going to be a good ending. Another analogy I think he makes, Frank Kermode, is like love. You're in the midst of a love story. All right? You have fallen in love with someone, and you don't know how it's going to end. But when that love itself, when you think of that love being fulfilled, and it's going to have a happy ending, then that casts a glow over the whole life before. You're living differently. You're going about your everyday business in a very different way because you expect good things to happen in this very delicate moment that's called love, this earthquake moment that's called love. It's a kind of apocalypse. Have a look now, the next source on your page, number 3, basically. This is one of those parts of the end of the book, chapter 9. It's almost the end of the book, that talks about everything that has been narrated in this letter, this transmission that Mordechai and Esther sent out to all the Jews to record everything that had happened. And why do we keep Purim? We keep these days so that future generations will know what happened at this historical moment. And we have a text now to record it. And what they saw fit, why they saw fit, that is, mara'u al-kacha, why the heroes and heroines of the story saw fit to do the things that they did. That's Rashi's comment. Those who did these deeds, that they did them. In other words, what the text is telling us, rather mysteriously here, is what did the heroes and heroines of this story, what was their motivation for doing the things that they did? Because it's somehow lacking in motivation. There's a lack of sense of direction, a lack of what's going on. For instance, and here are the examples that are given now. What did Achashverosh think he was doing when he made use of the holy vessels of the temple? Now, there's a mystery. It's a mystery. It's a mystery within a mystery, because there's no reference to the holy vessels of the temple in the text. This is a rabbinic understanding that Achashverosh took over from Cyrus, who conquered Jerusalem, and he was in some way in love with the power of the Jewish religion, the Jewish sense of order in the world. He saw the throne of Solomon in the temple, and he coveted it for himself. That's power. That is, that he wants to incorporate in his own regime the grandeur that was Jerusalem. That's the assumption by the rabbis. And so why are we given in such detail a description of all his wonderful vessels that he has in his court, all his wonderful furniture? It's like a Vogue magazine description in great concrete detail about all the beautiful, high-class deluxe vessels. And so the sages say, well, these were special vessels. They were the vessels that were stolen from the Beit HaMikdash, that were stolen from the temple. In other words, that in the mind of this pseudo-king, there is a desire to set up, in a way, a kind of replica to something he's seen. He couldn't help seeing in that transcendent kingdom that he has destroyed. He wants to co-opt it. He wants to adopt that glamour. Okay, and then Ma'agia Alehem, also we read in this book what happened to them. Excuse me. That Satan came and danced among them, and Achashverosh killed Vashti. What is Rashi saying here? We find in this book the motivation for the bizarre behavior of Achashverosh in killing Vashti. That's bizarre behavior. What possessed him? All right, Memuchan comes and tells him a story, a totalizing story about how all the women in all the kingdoms and call, totalized. Everyone is going to, all the women are going to disrespect their husbands. It's not Vashti alone who has disrespected you. This is going to be an epidemic of wifely disobedience to their husbands. Right? Does this ring a bell? Have you read that? Yeah. We didn't read about Satan dancing among them. That's what Rashi is now adding as a metaphor. What is it? Why did he decide to kill his, presumably, but all right, she wasn't exactly according to etiquette. She refused to come. The idea is that he kills her. He refuses to let her come into the presence of the king. And the Midrashic reading of that is, that means death. It means that if you don't come into the center of this place, if you are denied access to the center of the system, then that's death. What was Ahasuerus thinking? And the only answer Midrash can give is, everyone went crazy. He must have gone crazy. That's his motivation. Right? Satan came and danced among them. Sometimes that's all you can say about what is happening when things are going badly wrong. And you can't really find anywhere to pin it down. What is it? There's something systemic, therefore, about the atmosphere in his court, and he killed Vashti. Haman, for instance, what was his motivation? What did he see that made him jealous of Mordechai? I didn't know he was jealous of Mordechai. Where does it say in the text he was jealous of Mordechai? What we do see is that he's very angry that Mordechai doesn't bow down to him. Yes, that's what we see. But here again, the Midrashic traditions have a tradition. And the tradition is that what was at work was an emotion of a human being who is somewhat deranged by that emotion, and it's the emotion of jealousy. Now, of course, this is written from a very Judeo-centric point of view. That is, we and our kingdom and our heroes are so enviable that Ahasuerus really just wants to make a replica of our things, and Haman is jealous of our Jewish leader somewhere. Right? But I want to take it a little more seriously, that behind the anti-Semitism there is an implicit envy of some kind. There is some sense, which is not obvious in the text, but is a declaration of the Midrashic reading of the text, that it puts us somewhere to put us not so totally in the inferior, vanquished position, but in some way it's because we have a kind of edge that people can't help recognizing it. And then what about Mordechai, the heroes as well? They also behave strangely. Why doesn't he bow down and prostrate himself in front of Haman? Why make such a point of it and endanger your whole people? Right? It's a real question. You know, it's a question that arises. If you know that you're going to cause the death, you know, it's going to be then why be so obstinate? Right? I'm sure it's occurred to us to wonder. All right, what's the answer to that? You'll find it in the book. That's all that Rashi says. How will you find it? Not by reading the text as is, but by reading the text and reading the spaces between the text. By reading the text in the mode that's called lidaresh, lehidaresh. And the statement of the sages, a very general statement, which is very powerful, very important, that the Torah, Megillat Esther, like the Torah, nitna lehidaresh. It's a different kind of text from the text of the later writings, the 5 books of Moses and the book of Esther. They are singled out. They're going to last forever. Why? Because they're written in such a way that begs interpretation. It's such a way, it's an enigmatic way, like poetry. That's why I want to come back to the poetic theme now. Immediately after that passage, at the end of the book of Devarim, about the times of hiding God's face, next verse is, Va'ata kitvu lachem hashira hazot. And now write for yourselves this song and teach it to the children of Israel. Teach it to them, put it in their mouths. In other words, the whole idea of poetry, we said, the Torah is poetry. And now we're saying, in particular reference to the idea of hiddenness, Esther, that refers also to the book of Esther. The book of Esther is poetry like the Torah, in the same sense. The prose, right? There is no poem officially in the book of Esther. It's a hidden poem. It's a hidden prayer, right? There's something, if you know how to read, right? Here I'm pulling rank, you know. If you know how to read, if you are somewhere you're into it, how do you read? You read as if the text is composed of hints. That's what I want to say. The language of a poem is not just plonked down on the page as a kind of, concrete thing that obviously means what it means. It's associative. The language of a poem is meant to lead you in all directions. There are associations, there are suggestions. And so in some way, you barely land on the language. You don't land heavily on the language. In some way, you hover over the language. And you think, what does this evoke for me? That's what a poem does for you. And it widens the canvas extremely. Now, we're dealing with a time in which meaning is hard to find. Right? A whole epoch has ended, apparently. The people are in exile. There is no center to their being. And endings are hard to imagine. Right? Isn't that one of the Yiddish rueful aphorisms about the Golos? Ze schleppt sich wie ein Golos. Do you know that one? No? Nobody? Yes? It drags like the Golos. It goes on forever like Galut. The feeling of an endless situation, right? Certainly before we returned to the land, we haven't seen the end yet, clearly. But from this time onwards, perhaps we don't say it in exactly the same way. But sometimes we're reminded of it. That there's something about this interim state that doesn't allow for beautiful, brilliant anticipations, of conclusions. How is it all going to end? Realistically, even if we say that the second temple began to be built just at this time, what's the date there? 563 BC? I'm not very strong on dates. We're very proud of having a date for it. That was the wonderful moment when we had a new temple was born. It's also not a very satisfactory ending. Because the truth was, if you look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, that it was a very long, drawn-out, dragged-out process, full of delays, full of frustrations, 9 years delay in the building. Now, you don't want that when you're talking about your happy apocalypse. When you get your splendid ending, you don't want it to drag. And so what we have here is a dragging reality, which is full of pointless things, like exactly what the furniture looked like, what the all the very concrete, very highly brocaded. When I said Vogue magazine, I mean Vogue magazine. The kind of glamour that you experience. Maybe, when you look through the pages there. Oh, yeah. There's a kind of stupid radiance about it. It's a radiance that's nothing. Yeah. But it holds you for a moment. Here is our king who is sitting on Solomon's throne, according to the Midrash, on a replica of Solomon's throne, who is an upstart himself, who is not an heir to the throne, but is trying keshevet right away at the beginning there, as he was approximately sitting on the throne, ke, not be, as if he's slipping off the throne at every moment. He just can't quite hold it. So we have an insecure king who apparently has total power over the farthest reaches of the 127 kingdoms. And he has an excellent system of communications. Yes, that's emphasized with all kinds of exotic technological words that we barely understand. Patshegen, ashtarpenim, haratzim, all the system of runners, of couriers, that run and pass on the letters from one to the other. It goes like clockwork. Amazing. But who do you have at the center of it all? Who is the king that should be the authority behind that magnificent system of communication? Right? It's like Kafka's couriers who are running from one end of the world to the other, but there is no king anymore. The king has given them letters and the king has disappeared. And so they are calling enthusiastically to one another. you know, how important the letters are, but the letters don't come from anyone anymore. The center is gone. And that is the situation with Achashverosh. He is Melech Shoteh. All right, the sages have a number of, you know, juicy descriptions of him. He is a stupid king. Now, that's one thing you don't want. Even the fact that he's cruel is not as bad as the fact that he's stupid. There's a stupidity in this king who is so ready to, you know, to kill his wife just because of a slight insult, because she is of the royal dynasty, and he wanted to decorate his great day with her, and she refused to lend her yichus, her pedigree to that day. That's again according to the Midrashic reading. He's so easily offended. Melech hafachfach. That's what we say about Purim. He is a reversible king. He's a king who is extremely volatile and changes his mind at the slightest. You know, right? How much does it take for Haman to persuade the king to kill all the Jews in all the kingdoms, man, woman, and children? And again, that sense of totality and grandiosity, you know, which advertises something that has an empty center, because the king himself is a kind of nothing. If anything is batel, it's Achashverosh, who is so quick, levatel, he's so quick to nullify and suspend. You know, but any decree of his can never be suspended. Are you aware of that? Yes? That's why the king can never withdraw his decree to destroy all the Jews. A point is made of that in the text. In other words, these couriers have enormous power now. The fact that they've gone out with these, that's it. Even if he has no power himself, and he has no longer has given his ring of power first to Haman and then to Mordechai. Where is the meaning in all this? You know, we have a sense that the wind blows where it will, and that is precisely the sense of contingency and chance and nothing being important that has to do with Purim. Purim is the rule of chance, the rule of the lots. You cast lots. Well, wherever the knots, that's the temper of the regime that Esther finds herself now stuck right at the heart of. Yes, so let's have a look now. Yes, how does the conspiracy against the king get discovered? Incidentally, big time Materesh. Right? So this could have been a great moment for Mordechai. What happens? He just happens to be sitting there, and he hears the conspirators talking. That's in the text. Yeah? And he, instead of claiming glory for himself, he quietly gets a word through to Esther into the palace, and she quietly tells the authorities, and it's aborted. In other words, nothing is made of it. Mordechai could have become Mishneh LaMelech, but no, what do we read right away after that? It's Haman who weasels his way into becoming that through his genocide, through the projected genocide. He is going to now be the deputy to the king. And nothing is made. It's written down in the archives, the history at this moment, that the plot, the conspiracy against the king is aborted. It's written down in the archives, in the royal archives, and basically no one ever looks at them. Until one night when the king happens to be sleepless. You know, and everything happens in this trivial, you know, inconsequential kind of way. And whew, thank goodness for that. You know, suddenly there is a complication, and the king becomes aware now of what happened, that it was Mordechai who actually saved him. Up to now, it was just buried in the archives. Have a look now at number 5. The whole idea of chance, of casting lots to decide what is the day of destruction. When the lot fell in the month of Adar, the king, Haman, rejoiced with a great joy. Samach simcha gdola. He said, if the lot has fallen for me in the month, the lot has fallen for me in the month when Moshe died. How does he know that? He just happens to know that. He's a well-informed person. Moshe died on the 7th of Adar, which is actually tonight. Tonight, yes. That was when Moshe died. And immediately Haman rejoices. A great ending for my story. He recognizes a happy end because that was a bad day for the Jews. So the omens suddenly declare in his favor. From a certain, we would call this a kind of superstition. It's a superstition, the fiction of thinking that happy endings mean something. Of thinking fictions are always fictions. Fictions are creations that we make in order to have a meaningful, happy conclusion to the lostness that we feel in the middle. Suddenly we have a sense of direction. And Haman feels reaffirmed now. He feels extremely happy. Ominous day for the Jews. I'm sure to succeed. What he didn't know, lo haya yodea, lo yada. That's going to be very important, not knowing. What he didn't know was that Moshe was also born on that day. Now, how does that change things? Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar, and he died on the 7th of Adar. So what does that do to Haman's story? What does it do? I suppose what it means is, it's a very down-to-earth understanding, it's a very realistic understanding, that it's inconsequential, that it's superstitious, that Haman is being superstitious. This is a good day for the Jews, this is a bad day for the Jews. Moshe came into the world, Moshe went out of the world. That's not a way to think. That's not a way to guide your life in the present. By thinking of historical landmarks or historical paradigms and saying, well, if this happened then it's going to happen now. It's going, and tying yourself to that in a factual way. It seems to me there's a kind of alternative sense that the sages want us to move towards. What do we do with the chanciness then, with the contingency of real life? Really, just on any day? Moshe died and he was born on the same day. We can make quite a different fiction of that. We can say Moshe will always be born. He will always be reborn. Right? There are all kinds of ways of manipulating a fiction. What do we have here, rather? We have, looking at the next source on your page, number 6. This relates to the pasuk is not there. All right, chapter 2, verse 11 goes like this: B'chol yom vayom, every single day, Mordechai was walking in front of the court of the house of women, the courtyard of the women's house, where Esther is. This is towards the beginning of the story. To know the welfare of Esther and what would be done with her. Ma ye'aseh ba. Ladat et shlom Esther u'ma ye'aseh ba. And here is a kind of redundant, you might say. Why do we need to hear this? That he's pacing around there, outside her windows. He doesn't get to talk to her. She's there in the harem, in the general collection of women. And he's pacing around to know what's with her. Maybe she's able to send him some news. What will be done with her? To know. Now, to know in this book is very significant. What you know can change everything, and not knowing can leave you in the dark about the meaning of the present, the meaning of the present moment. And so Mordechai is looking for knowledge. Now, if we look at our source here from the Midrash on Esther, David and Mordechai, two heroes, were given a hint and they sensed it. Now, that word is very important. Remez v'chashu. Lachush. Lachush is literally the senses. Their senses prickled. They were alive to the implications of it. They were given a hint. A hint is not a prophecy. No one was given any prophecy here. No one was given privileged information of salvation. Everyone really was in the horror and the terror of what is happening. But there was a hint. Now, that's what I want to think about now. There was a hint, and they were sensitive to it. They sensed it, it says here. It's a nice translation. And it says, Mordechai, every day he was walking around there in the courtyard to know what had happened to her, what was happening with her. Mordechai was thinking as he was pacing, what was he looking for? Is it possible that this righteous woman should be married to this uncircumcised man? La arel hazeh. All right, that's obviously a term of abuse here. This uncircumcised man means this lowlife. Yes, I won't give the obvious translation. If it were not that in the future something great will happen upon Israel, Ye'erah, is the idea of a kind of cataclysm. Something will fall on them. Irua is something that happens to you, and often not good. But here, clearly good. He wants it to be good. Something is about to befall, shall we say. Befall is a good word. Is going to befall Israel, and Israel are going to be saved through her. That's the hint that he senses in events. It's a very questionable hint. But maybe hints are always questionable. A hint is what you do when you, my down-to-earth example, you're at a party and you think it's time to leave. Now you've had enough of this party. And you give just a little look at your wife, your husband, your significant other, and he is supposed to understand that you mean it's time to go. But no one else is supposed to understand. It's a hint that is covered. What does the Oxford English Dictionary say about hints? It's a covered but intelligible message of some kind. It's possible to understand it if you are in the know somehow, if you have a relationship with a person, for instance, or you have a relationship with a text, you can sense when there is a hint, or you will have a certain kind of sensitivity to reality. That's what's being claimed here. That Mordechai has a certain highly tuned awareness of the tragic reality in which he finds himself. Why tragic? Again, because of the Midrashic reading of the text. In the text itself, you won't find any clarity. In the text itself, you'll find confusion and enigmas and bizarreness, one piled on the other. What is the Midrash? It's the attempt by the rabbis to sense the text and to sense the implications, the hints in the text. If it says the king was approximately sitting on the throne, Keshevet, it expresses some insecurity in his being on the throne. For instance, just as an example, if your wife has something in her eye, it's not she has something in her eye, it's that she's telling me something. She's telling me that it's time to go. Right? Someone else won't notice it, and it's not necessarily really there, you might say. It is really there. If you saw it, it's there. And Mordechai was good at that. What was he good at? Living through this reality in which, again according to the Midrashic reading, in which his niece, whom he has brought up as his daughter, and who actually is his wife, according to the Midrash. Beto. She is his wife, but that's hidden in the text. Right? It wouldn't do for you to be too aware of that. But there is an intimate relationship between them, which makes the horror much greater, that she has now been kidnapped to be the king's wife. And now she has to be in an intimate relationship with another man. So there's a terrible sense of displacement. Things are not as they should be. Everything, a certain relationship, there's a husband, there's a wife, right? There's a father, there's a daughter. What is she doing there? Something is terribly wrong. She is in the heart of darkness. She is right there, having relations with the master of darkness. Such things couldn't happen, she says, unless something is impending. So we don't know what. Atidim. Atidim is there's a kind of, something is looming over us. And we hope it's a good thing. And she will be the key to it. She will be placed just in the right place. Now, he doesn't know that for sure. And it is a kind of weak, it's a very weak hint, we'd have to say. You know, really? That's what you base yourself on? Things are so bad, so there have to be something good coming? Well, I don't know what I want to say at this point. I just want to, that's the logic here. It can't be. It is, but we haven't got to the end of the story. We don't know yet what the resolution is going to be like. And she is going to be used in some way. This is not prophecy. Prophecy is something else. Miriam had a prophecy. You know, she told her parents, you better get together again because there's a baby to be born who will be the savior of Israel. Again, according to the Midrash. So she's a prophetess. That's what she's called. And she hangs around when the baby is put in the river, in the box in the river, l'de'ah, waiting for the knowledge of what would be done to him. And on that, Rashi says, she's waiting to know what will be the end of her prophecy. In other words, this is no hint for her. She's had a prophecy. She's been given a divine message, and she just wants to know how it's going to work out. She's standing there waiting, not in existential angst, but just almost with a kind of curiosity, motivated curiosity, you know. So how is it going to work out? That's a very different situation from hinting. What do we have in hinting? I want to quote on the Jewish side, before I expose you to what poets have to say about this, poets and creative writers have to say about this. On the Jewish side, there is this idea, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut, gave it to us. It's not on your page. B'chol drachecha de'ehu. How do you know God? In all your ways. In other words, in whatever you do, you should know God. God is there to be known in all your ways. What does in all your ways mean? And here Rabbi Nachman has an extraordinary passage. It's in Nun Daled 54 in Likutei Moharan. I didn't put it on your page because it occurred to me after the source page was in. And it goes like this. Basically says a person should always remember the world to come. Alma da'ati. A person should always remain cognizant, somehow aware of the world to come. And what is the world to come? What is being aware of the world to come? That there isn't just one world. Now, we tend to think there's only one world. That's Olam Hazeh, with all its limitations and all its uninspired, contingencies and trivialities and banalities and perversities. But there is another world. But that's not what Rabbi Nachman wants to say. What he wants to say is he should always remember the world to come in this world. That this world is already the beginning of the world to come. That in things that happen to us, there is something that we can draw from. We can draw a sense of God from the real experiences in this world, the real live experiences, where we really feel alive, where we are really engaged. The things that really engage us in this world, that's where there is the beginning of a revelation. If you just think about it, if you follow it in some way, it can lead you away towards the future. That in some way, you won't know exactly, but there's a sense somewhere of a complexity here. There are two worlds here. Have a look at the end of your source page. I put on some quotations from Keats and Henry James, one of the greatest poets and novelists of the 19th century, early 20th. This is Keats in a very famous letter. Now, it appears to me that almost any man may, like the spider, spin from his own innards his own airy citadel. The points of leaves and twigs on which the spider begins her work are few, and she fills the air with a beautiful circuiting. Let us not therefore go hurrying about and collecting honey-bee-like honeybees, buzzing here and there impatiently from a knowledge of what is to be arrived at. But let us open our leaves like a flower and be passive and receptive, budding patiently under the eye of Apollo, the sun, and taking hints from every noble insect that favors us with a visit. Now, this is not just poets he's addressing, but almost every man. Isn't that what he says at the beginning? Almost any man. I love the almost. Some people are really well armored against this, but almost anyone is open to, what shall we call it? Intuitions, is open to, if I really quiet myself of my impatience to get to the bottom line, always wanting to know, wanting to hold it, wanting to grasp it, or if I can just quiet myself, go into some kind of meditative state, perhaps. Keats wonderfully called it diligent indolence. There's the diligent indolence, a diligent laziness, a passivity, a receptivity. Things come to you. Things come to you, little things happen, and on the basis of those little things, right, little points of twigs, a mere point, the spider begins to weave this tremendous citadel in the air. The rabbis have an expression for that, the sages, migdal ba'avir, migdalim ba'avir, to express that larger reach of human imagination, transcendence, intuition. Henry James, a very different writer, talking about the idea that you write from experience. But what does that mean? You really only write from concrete things that you know about, in the least meaning, the lowest meaning of to know. Experience, he says, is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web, the same image, of the finest silken threads suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue. A mere nothing, floating around in the air. It catches it, it takes to itself the faintest hints of life. It converts the very pulses of the air into revelations. And nothing is the basis of it, something that no one else would have paid attention to. But the poet, the writer, makes something of it. It begins to build up in the poet's mind. He claimed to have based one of his novels, What Maisie Knew, on a story that a neighbor at a dinner party told him, which wasn't very close, in fact, to his story. It was not so close, but suddenly a revelation opens up. Now, this is the creative mind, and for Keats at least, almost any human being has this kind of creativity. It's not closed to the normal person, to make something of hints, of suggestions. How do Chazal put it? How do the sages put it? We are reaching now an epoch in the time of Esther. It's the end of an age and the beginning of a new age. That was a time of God's presence. Now is the time of God's absence, or shall we say, galut hashchina, exile. Things are not in their right places. All relationships are a little awry. The proper basic relationships are not, there's no center, and there's no sense of an ending. Right? There's no sense of meaning implicit. What are we left with? Now, this is the expression, dai lechakima beremiza. It's sufficient for a wise person, a chacham. Here, the chachamim are talking about themselves. Right? For sages, for a sage person, for a person of wisdom, which doesn't just mean the sages, it means every wise person, a hint is enough. A wise person knows what to make of intimations, of indications, knows how to create a larger, call it a fiction, but a fiction is not always untrue. It's simply that it's human-made. A fiction is something that I have put together myself. It could be very true. Fictions, myths, express truths. And here the sages see themselves as in that role, that they are going on the basis of hints in the text that lead them to a sense of hiddenness, of what's hidden behind the text, the Hester. And what inaugurates that new period is a tragic story, a story with all but tragic ending, which gives you the sense of what has been lost. What has been lost is that sense of presence. And now I want very quickly just to touch on chapter 4, which is Esther's moment of absolute abandonment. Right? Here she doesn't pray. This is the chapter, and I'll talk about it in general terms since our time is running out. This is the moment when Haman, who knows what has happened, says, Mordechai yada. This is straight after the plot of the king and Haman, which took place in camera, enclosed in the palace. How would anyone have known? And so the sages say, strangely but wonderfully, Mordechai knew because he had a dream. He had a dream that told him what was about to happen, but more importantly, what had caused what was about to happen. Somewhere that he has a sense of knowing something about the inner history of the people. And he puts on sackcloth and ashes and stands outside the palace, demonstrating mourning. And the queen hears about this, and she is totally shocked. What's going on out there? Why is he? He's dressed up in mourning. What's he telling? So she sends a messenger to invite him in. And the messenger is carrying normal clothes for him to change his clothes, because he can't go into the palace wearing mourning. That's completely inappropriate. He refuses to change his clothes. And at this point, we read a very strange word, "Vatitchalchal hamalka," that the queen was extremely agitated when she gets this news, that he refuses to change his clothes. Why? The obvious meaning is that she realizes that there's something terrible going to happen. If he is so deep in mourning, his clothes in some way cannot be changed. But it's mourning. There's something irreducible about this. But again, reading between the lines, she realizes that he's not going to come into the palace. He refuses to come into the palace and talk to her. That's when he refuses the clothes. He is refusing to come and talk to her. That is, they're not going to have a face-to-face relationship. He is not going to talk to her in person. She's not going to talk back to him in person. And the whole chapter that follows, read it in detail for yourselves. I'm going to touch on one or two moments. The whole chapter has to do with the movement of the messenger. His name is, as he moves in and out, passing messages from one to the other. It's really almost satirical at some points. The whole verses are given to the fact that he took her message out to him, and another verse, and then he took his message out to her, into her, even without any words of the message in that. It's not the content. In other words, the content is important. The content is, who knows? Yeah. Right? He tells her, you have to go and ask for salvation for your people. That's the content. We'll come back to that in a moment. Meantime, he's not going to tell her that in person. And instead, the conversation between them is conveyed by a messenger. And that is at least as important as the content of the message, because it tells us something about the loss of presence. She's not going to have in front of her her presumably very dear, whatever it was, uncle, father, quasi-father, husband. There's not going to be that sense of relationship, not that sense of things being in the right place. You tell me what to do, and then I do it. And, this is how it has to go, according to the normal structures. But there is no normal structure now, and all we have now is couriers running backwards and forwards with messages. And the idea then of language now coming to replace presence. Now you have words replacing prayer. Now you have Torah shebal peh. You have the words of the mouth as being Torah, oral Torah, in place of written Torah, which has a certain sense of presence in it, has a certain sense of miracles and extraordinary things happening, all that. And what you have now is Esther isolated. She says, I can't do that. Right? She says no, first of all. I can't go and plead for their lives, because everyone knows that there's only one thing can befall me, which is death if I go in unsummoned, except if the king suddenly decides he likes me. And that's not, in other words, the whim of the king, which is a very far, especially as, and this is the real blow of revelation to us. She just says, almost an offhand way, I haven't been called to come to the king, Zeh 30 yom. It's a 30-day absence now from the king. So in other words, he's tired of me already. Right? If everything depends on the king's desire in this world, then I'm no longer there in that radiance of the king's desire. And that's it. I'm going to be killed as soon as I appear in the door there. That is a completely rational interpretation of events. And Mordecai has nothing good to tell her. He can't reassure her. He can't say, oh, it will end well. I have a prophecy. No prophecies. But he just says, Mi yodea im le'et kazot higat lemalchut. Who knows? What a weak promise. Who knows? Perhaps it was just for this moment that you came into power. This was always meant to be your moment. Right? And you'll know when you know. In other words, if he lets you in, then that fiction will be vindicated, that it really was just for this moment. But you can't depend on it. He doesn't offer her false reassurance. And he says, and you don't think to save yourself, even, if everyone else dies, because you and the house of your father, which means me, we'll all perish in this. It all depends on you, maybe. There is a mi yodea there. There is a who knows there. And that's a very important expression in the prophets, actually. Occasionally in the book of Jonah, in the book of Joel, you have that mi yodea, which gives you the sense of the tenuousness. And the, of course, we know by hindsight, the rightness of the heroic decision unsupported by any certainty at all. The queen, Vatilbash Malchut, she clothes herself in royalty. The sages say, well, wasn't she always wearing royal clothes? No, it means before she goes in there, she clothes herself in Ruach HaKodesh, in some sense of divine inspiration, that really, yes, this is the moment that I must go. But as she stands there, Vata'amod, she comes to a standstill there at the entrance, and there again the sages detect something, a crisis. She stands there like a deer in the headlights. Nistalka mimena shchina. What a story the sages are telling here. At that moment, that sense of God's presence abandons her. I mean, it's so cruel that I hesitate to narrate it, but that's what it is. That's what the Midrash has to say. In that moment, she is without that sense of presence that can inspire. And what she's left with, strictly speaking, is herself. What she's left with is the sense that with that sense of it could be, mi yodea, that's where she has to be, which is the sense that all heroes and heroines have had throughout history, including non-Jewish saviors during the Shoah, who risked their lives in order to, on a mi yodea, on a hint of revelation. And I use the word rightly, revelation. It's a hint of, a sense of, this is what I must do. I must do it because what? No one else knows what I know. I just know that's how it has to be. It's that sense that circumstances themselves tell me that I can't say no. And we see it working here in Esther at the very moment that it works, when she says, no, I can't. And then she says, okay, everyone fast for me, and I'll fast too. I'll fast too. What does that mean? Ibn Ezra, who's always very realistic, says it means that she is risking not looking nice on that day. If you fast for 3 days, you're not going to look at your best, and the king is not going to particularly be attracted to you as you stand there in the doorway. Now that's it's a shockingly down-to-earth reading, but it has something. It gives us a sense. This is what it depends on. This is what the king's whim depends on, apparently. That he's going to, will he like her? And she doesn't care. In other words, she's not there to pander to the king's whim. She is there on another principle. There's another principle at work here. And so she doesn't care how she looks, and she is there. And then Chazal says something very powerful here again. They say, so shelo yomru. So the Israelites shouldn't say, Bnei Israel shouldn't say, the Jews shouldn't say, we have a sister in the palace, and she is sure to intercede for us. I thought that was the whole point, that we would have, because of this long drawn-out whole plot, going over 12 years of meaningless activities, right? Wasted years that nothing happens in them, basically. So she gets married to him in the 7th year of the king's reign, right? It's the king's reign, in the 12th year, the whole plot takes place. What about all that empty time before? The idea that she should have that as a kind of assurance, a guarantee. I've been put into the palace, or the people should have that as a guarantee. That's the wrong way to go. If they think that, yasichu da'atam min harachamim, then they'll move their minds away. They'll distract themselves by thinking they have guarantees. They're right there in the center of the palace is our woman. Then they'll distract their minds min harachamim, from the relationship with God, which is a relationship of compassion. That is, from the essential. All right, that maybe they're working for them. That's not what they should be thinking about. They should be thinking about a relationship to that in them that leaves at least hints in their lives, some indications in their lives, and know how to make something of a remez, how to make something of a hint. Now, that would mean the ability to read in a certain way, to have a sense of things that is acute, an acute sense of certain things. And I want to finish with a relatively modern source, which is at the end of your page, the source before the English ones that we looked at just before. And I want to finish with, this is Rav Hutner, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, and we'll do this very quickly. Yes, number 10 on your page. Rav Hutner says this: Purim comes just before Pesach. What's the relation between Purim and Pesach? In fact, in a leap year, we do Purim in the second month of Adar, so that it's really just before. It's always just a month, not 2 months. To keep the two in a bracket in some way, they belong together. Right? The larger story is Purim Pesach. What is it about Purim Pesach? And here, Purim, both of them, says Rav Hutner, have ways in which you can recognize the anarchy of God. God declares himself in the Pesach story, Anochi, I'm here. When does he say that? He says that at the revelation at Mount Sinai. I am the Lord your God who has brought you out of the land of Egypt. Right? The world is full of radiance. You know, this is meaningful action by God in the world, and here I am at the very center of it. That's one way of knowing the anarchy of God. The other way is the Purim way. And he doesn't judge between them in a concrete way, in an obvious way. The other one is Anochi haster astir et panai. I am the one who hides my face. Now that's a different way of knowing God. And then he does his creative thing, Rav Hutner, and he says this: it's like being in a dark night, very dark night, and you are required to recognize somebody during that dark night, recognize people. 2 things you can do. The Pesach thing to do would be to have a good flashlight on that dark night. Miracles, moments of real seeing of God, presence of God. So you have a flashlight, and at least you can see somewhat. You can see with a flashlight, you can recognize the other person. But on a really dark night, where God says, I'm going to hide my face from you, then what you are left with is the possibility, he says, of developing another sense, chush acher, which would be the sense of hearing in the parable. That is, if you have a very acute ear, you can go pretty far just by getting the other person to talk, and then you'll know their voice. Now, which is the better method? In obvious ways, seeing is better than hearing. You recognize, even if it's with a flashlight, you're more likely to identify the other person correctly than just by the sense of hearing. The sages themselves know that that's a very chancy thing, the sense of hearing. But what is it about the end of days? The whole Pesach way of using the flashlight, of using miracles and revelations and God's presence to recognize God, that will be irrelevant at that time, because the light of that time will be so strong, the radiance will be so great, that all those little miracles will seem like a cheap flashlight. All those, they'll be irrelevant at that time. But if at that time, when the light is so great, and this is the end of things, the imagined end of things, the envisioned end of things, if at that time you have acquired a new sense, chush acher, you've taught yourself, and he uses these expressions, imenet atzmo, limedet atzmo, you've trained yourself to hear when you can't see. That will last forever. Then you'll come into that final time, the richer for it. Your eye, if I can play with it, your anarchy will have become the larger, be transformed. As Buber puts it, he says that the customary self is expanded and transfigured. There are moments when that happens. The customary self is expanded and transfigured into the surprise self. That is, there is a sense somewhere of a larger self. I am more for the fact that I can hear, that I am a good reader of texts, that I can read and listen to the text, and I can hear those hints. I can hear those intimations that are just there hiding behind the black letters or between the black letters and the spaces. So there's something here about what you can acquire, a kind of acquisition, kind of accomplishment that one can acquire perhaps only in darkness. So it's a light that is obscured, comes out in very strong glimmers through the sense of hearing, and then in the end of days remains as a sense of identity, a sense of who we are in that final radiance. Thank you.